Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic podcast with Rod Dreer. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and we're here for episode number 26. Now, Rod, we are going to tentatively title this episode Gradually, Then Suddenly, but we will gradually get to our topic and then suddenly get to it. But anyway, can't help but notice, and I'm sure the folks at home can't help but notice, especially for those of you watching, that you have a hat on. What is
Mon
the
chapeau.
story with the hat, sir?
Well, my son Matt and I went to Vienna last week. I had to give a workshop there at the Alliance Defending Freedom, and we also took a few days just to see the city. He was really interested in Vienna, and he's heading back to the U.S. pretty soon. So I said, why not? And I found this hat there in Vienna. It just seemed like the summertime thing to do, a little folly. But we had a great time there in the city. I hate to say that any weight I lost over here in Europe has been completely put back on by all the Kaiserschmarrn, the sort of glorious French toast-like dish that they serve there, and lots of schnitzel. But in all seriousness, though, there's really nothing like being in a city like that. Yeah. To contemplate the rise and fall of ideas, of empires, things like that. And I was telling Matt, I mean, just to think about that, a lot of Europe was ruled from this city for a long time. And now it just seems like a very pleasant but provincial city.
Well, that sort of calls to mind something you've been reminding me and really your audience that it can happen here. That we do get this sort of sense that we live in a sort of fixed world in which it'll always be this way. And I'm sure the people of Vienna, when they were in the full flower of their dominion, never felt that it would be otherwise, right? I mean, this is one of those things we always kind of buy into, and yet, it's like you said, Vienna is no longer Vienna. It's a lovely place to visit, but it's not doesn't rule the world, so to speak.
No. There are some great books about the whole fall of the Habsburg Empire. I think we talked before about the novel The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. He was a Viennese writer who, told the story of the rise and fall, or rather not the rise and fall, but the fall of the Habsburgs through the story of three generations of a military family, the empire. But the book to read, I think, for anybody who's interested in this is called The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig, Zweig. Zweig was part of Roth's generation, Viennese Jewish, really a brilliant literary talent. Had to leave it all after the coming of the Nazis, fled to Brazil where he and his wife committed suicide. Wow. And there's a scene in The World of Yesterday in which he talks about this villa that he and his wife had bought because he was really one of the best known writers of his era. Yeah. They bought a villa in northern Austria on the Austrian border. And on the other side of the valley was Berchtesgaden, Hitler's retreat, mountain retreat. So anyway, one of the reasons that book is so interesting to read is because he talks about Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, when it was at the peak of its power in modernity, the Habsburg Empire. And it was just a glorious place, but he also had, that's like the introductory chapter. The chapter after that, though, talks about the rot beneath all the beauty and how the seeds for the collapse of the Habsburgs and the collapse of Europe, the old European old world, were right there under their noses, but they couldn't see it because of all the beauty and the pleasure.
Always struck by that phenomena, that you are sort of going about your business and, living normal life, and there are currents and streams and forces and tectonic plates that are moving under you that you're almost completely unaware of, that are hugely consequential to your future, to our future, and the future of the sort of the current situation. It always fascinates me, honestly.
Yeah, and this is, I think, why I'm always been drawn to decline and fall narratives, because it's almost morbid on my part of it, but I'm just interested to know how people, or to contemplate how people don't see what's right in front of them. This is a very human thing. I wrote on my Substack today, on the day here we're recording this, I wrote on it in yesterday's Substack that about this novel I read called Embers by a Hungarian man named Sándor Márai. He was born in 1900, died in 1989. But this is a book also about decline and fall. The whole thing is told over the course of one evening. It's kind of a short novel, and really more of a novella, where an elderly general, it's set in 1940, in his Hungarian castle, an elderly general meets a man who had been his best friend at military academy back in Vienna before the First World War. And they had been very close friends. They had a falling out, and it had a shattering impact on their lives. Now, how this relates to the whole decline and fall thing is the general came from a wealthy family, and he always believed that the world was meant to be the way it is.
Sure.
And this sort of structure of the imperial order was just normal.
Yeah.
His friend at the military academy came from a family that was impoverished, and his parents had to literally go hungry sometimes to keep him there in the military academy. But the friend loved music, and music in this story stands for passion. And the general says in the narrative, he goes, "I never understood music." That's the key to the whole thing, that the general did not understand the role of the irrational, of passion in human affairs. And this is a sort of thing that led to not only to the destruction of their friendship, but, as I think the author, Sándor Márai, is saying, to the destruction of Europe.
Wow. Yeah, no, and so I think this brings us to a piece you shared with me late last night. And so I really haven't had a chance I scanned it, but I really want to hear your thoughts on it. It's, it's a piece by a gentleman named Tanner Greer. And why don't you tell us a little bit about this, Rod, and so we can maybe kind of chew on it out loud here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece. One of the readers on my blog tipped me off to. It's called Culture Wars or Long Wars. Tanner Greer is talking about how culture changes. And he starts out by saying that the Republicans and the conservatives have not been fighting a culture war.
Here in this country, everybody.
In this country, in the US. Yeah, we're only talking about the US.
Yeah.
He says that conservatives did not fight a culture war. They fought a political war over culture. And the difference is this. He said that the conservatives never bothered to try to change the culture. They rather tried to get political power using cultural issues and cultural conflict to get political power, but they didn't try to change the culture because they thought the culture was already theirs. And I'm old enough to remember that. You probably are too. When the religious right was becoming a big thing in the 1980s, the assumption that they and a lot of ordinary conservatives had was that the American people were fine. There was nothing wrong with the American people. The problem was these rotten liberal elites who ran the government, who ran our institutions. And if we could just get political power, we'd get them sorted and everything would be right again. Well, Tanner Greer says that was a real mistake, because that was an orthodoxy that allowed the people at that time, Republicans at that time, to blind themselves to what was happening within the culture.
Yeah, just to pick up that up, in of course the 80s, this was the moral majority, right? This idea that there was this sort of large reservoir of sort of, I guess what you and I would jokingly call normies, sort of Americanist normies. And then of course before that is you have the silent majority of the 70s, I think of Nixon. Is Nixon the one who dubbed that? Or at least his operatives, but the idea that there was, underneath the sort of the loudness of the coasts and the elites, there were tons and tons and tons of people like folks like me and you, that kind of idea. And meanwhile, so it sounds to me like the Greer is talking about sort of on the top sphere of all this, you are having electoral wars essentially, right? Or judicial wars and all of these things. And underneath, there was this other thing going on, this genuine culture war that was not so much about it. He talks about it as not so much a war from cohort to cohort, but a war of cohorts for another cohort's children and grandchildren.
Right,
so I wonder if you could
right.
tease that out a little bit. I was really taken by that idea.
Yeah, I'm looking here at the notes I made.
Mhm.
He says that culture changes through cohort change, and that's a phrase he got from Robert Putnam, the bowling alone guy at
Oh yeah.
Harvard.
Oh yeah.
And this is Greer. He says cultures do not change when people replace old ideas with new ones. They change when people with new ideas replace the people with old ones. And what he's trying to say about where we are now, I believe, is that during the 1980s, when conservatives were the dominant force in American politics. I mean, they weren't an uncontested force, certainly, but
Sure.
they were the dominant force. The
And they had
the
receipts, right? I mean, just to interrupt, sorry, but they had
yeah
receipts. I mean, you and I have talked before about the depressed and just um, we had really lost a sense of our own sort of American pride, so by the end of the 70s, the last gasp of the 70s was really depressing. I mean,
yeah
we've talked about gas lines. You and I both have memories of gas lines. We have memories of the Iran hostage crisis. I mean, it was
yeah
a really, and I wonder if folks just younger than us don't really appreciate just what Reagan sort of steps into, and why were the Republicans a dominant force for much
yeah.
of the 80s.
This is an important point, and I thought that I had read this in Tanner Greer's essay, but in fact, it was in this book that I'm reading right now called "The Light That Failed." It was,
Mm,
let's see, I think I even have it right here. Let me pull it up. "The Light That Failed" by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes.
mm,
They're two liberal scholars
mhm.
who do an assessment of why liberal democracy did not take over the world after the Soviet Union fell. And one of the things they point out there in the book, or this dovetails exactly with what Tanner Greer says, is that a worldview, a framework for seeing the world begins to crack when events happen that it can't explain.
Uh,
Now,
mm.
you and I, see, I'm 54, you're like 50, right?
I'm 48. Yeah.
48. Okay, so we're roughly the same age. I
Yep.
can remember, yeah, let me back up a little.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I know it's true what you say about young people can't understand this, because I constantly argue with my son, Matt, who's
Mm,
21, about this. Matt's a birdie bro.
yep.
And, he just thinks Reagan was the worst thing ever. And,
Yeah.
I point out to him, yeah, there were definitely some flaws with Reagan, and I'm not a zombie Reaganite, but
Yeah.
he said, Matt, you can't understand why Reagan, where he came from and why he
Yeah.
was important if you didn't live through the 70s or haven't immersed yourself in the culture of the 70s, the
Right.
stagflation, the
Mhm.
sense of the overwhelming sense of American defeat. We
Right.
came out of Vietnam in the mid 70s. There was Watergate in 74.
Yeah.
Carter came in and he seemed completely impotent in the face of this enormous economic crisis. I said to Matt, I said, look, Matt, I took you that time when we lived in St. Francisville, my Louisiana hometown. I took you to the Ford garage, and they had a little cabinet of memorabilia from the family that's owned the garage for decades.
Yeah.
I said, don't you remember that button that said, ask us about our low 14% interest rates? I
Which
had
is,
to finance a card 14%
I
in
mean,
1978.
that's just staggering. 14%. I mean, gosh, that's like a low-end credit card these days. I mean, geez,
yeah.
like that's
But
crazy.
But anyway, you and I could talk about this forever. But I've also told him about what it felt like when Jimmy Carter came on national TV early in the morning
Mhm.
to announce the failure of the hostage rescue attempt,
Yeah.
and just that sense of total national impotence and
Yeah.
humiliation. Then there was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So by the time Reagan came along, we were desperate for a new way of seeing the world.
Right. And what strikes me so much about, Matt and his generation, and I'm not throwing shade, Matt's a great guy, but just, I say I've taught Matt's, right? I mean, much of my career in education sort of is an overlap of Matt's generation. And they have inherited a world in which the Soviet Union was always going to fail. They've inherited a world in which United States of America was always going to win the Cold War. And it was not at all clear, in the late 70s that this was an inevitability. I was joking with you earlier, I always think of that movie Miracle, which of course is a great movie. It captures when the United States forms their Olympic hockey team and they, against all odds, defeat the Soviet juggernaut. And, you know, the
1980
Americans,
Olympics. Yeah.
at the 1980 Olympics in Lake Placid, I believe. And, you know, the Americans were the scrappy underdogs. We were not this sort of this dominant force of, you know, inevitability. It was the Soviet Union that had lined everything up with their command economy and their command athletic committee, and they were the future, right? And so for the Americans to sort of scrap together and beat the great juggernaut was miraculous. I mean, it was exuberant. It was exhilarating beyond one's comprehension. And yet now looking back on it, you know, it's very easy to not understand that kind of emotional space that the country kind of existed in, you know, we Americans kind of existed in 1979, 1980.
Yeah.
You know,
But
it was not at all a fait accompli.
But one of the things reading the Greer essay did to me, though, was remind me, the Greer essay also and The Light That Failed, is to remind me that we can't, I'm meaning people of my generation, we can't allow ourselves to be blind to the events that discredited the point of view that formed our worldview.
Right.
And I think that let's speculate for a second on what that might be. I think that, you know, my son came of age in the defeat of the Iraq War, you know, and then
give us a date.
Okay, Matt was born in '99, and he was precocious. He learned how to read. Plus, he lives in a home with people who talk about this stuff. But Matt only knows about American power in terms of defeat of Iraq and just the mess that was Iraq. And then came the 2008 financial crash.
Right.
And so Matt he's born in '99. You know, he's starting to pay attention a lot to politics in a period in which his generation faces a lot more of a chaotic future than our generation did.
Right.
And plus the internet came along. It wasn't just those events. There was the internet, which made things a lot more fluid, and you know, all kind of social structures had become quite fluid. So naturally he turns, I say naturally because I understand this emotionally now, he turns to somebody like Bernie Sanders, who promises that the state can get involved and make things less scary for you. Now that sort of thing, initially, you know, I react against it, even though I can say, and have been saying for years on my blog, that the Republicans have got to get away from zombie Reaganism because the world really has changed. But socialism is not the answer. But this is something that my son struggles to comprehend because he didn't have the emotional experience that you and I had back when the country was in so much trouble and Reagan was the answer.
Right. Because that's what I mean, you know, sort of coming at it from the differing perspectives, you know, what you take as your assumption, so, you know, can radically alter your conclusions, you know. And I love what Greer says in that piece. He says old orthodoxies were designed to solve old problems, and so therefore when new problems emerge and you cart out the old orthodoxies, it's experienced, I'm sure, and seen from, you know, the newer generation as hopelessly nostalgic, hopelessly naive, hopelessly insufficient to explain the current predicament.
Well, exactly. Just as, Kale, the Great Society liberalism that the generation just above us believed in, it couldn't explain the world that you and I were coming of age in. And even when I went through this brief period in late high school, early college, when I was a liberal, I was constantly hit by the reality that, you know, the things my side was saying, it was really, it couldn't explain what was happening. This was only just reaction against Reaganism.
Yeah. I mean, you know, another memory that I have of as a kid, do you remember the date of the first Gulf War off the top of your head, roughly speaking?
Was it 91?
91. That's what I was thinking.
I think it was 91. Yeah.
So I'm a senior in high school when all this is happening, and you know, we take American flags and support our troops as being a kind of a normal thing now, but in even in the 80s, in the late 80s, it was really kind of, we were still living in the aftermath of the Vietnam War in terms of our attitude toward the armed forces, in terms of our attitude toward patriotism. And I remember like the support our troops movement sort of came out, and it was kind of a big deal. And you would put those little like posters on your, those lawn signs, and support our troops was a big thing. And I remember because I was a big aficionado of, I read Rolling Stone magazine and all that sort of stuff. Like people and our cultural elites, our cultural manufacturing contingent they were really unhappy with this whole support our troops movement, because it was kind of a strange throwback patriotism to, prior to the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and strangely enough, now that we're in 2021,
yeah,
I have the same kind of, again, I back up when I see the support our troops, because it feels to me like it's manufacturing consent. It's bullying people to consent to war. Like, you don't support the war, then you don't support the troops. Or if you want to support the troops, you have to support the war. And I can remember talking to my brother-in-law, who spent a year or so in Iraq during that war. And I remember asking him, like, what is it like when people like my mom, frankly, come up to you and say, thank you for your service and all that? He said, well, it's nice on the one hand, but on the other hand, you just want to say, you have no idea what you're saying. And if you go back, I know you probably read All Quiet on the Western Front.
Of course, yeah.
That classic World War I novel, where Paul Baumer, the protagonist, he and his troops, they get a weekend of R&R, and they go back home, and they're sitting there in the cafe back home, and all the people who are not having to live with what they have to live with coming and slapping them on the back, buying them beer, saying, thank you for your service. And anyway, I think about that a lot. And I think that, to go back to the Greer thing for a second, he also says that culture wars are fought for the hearts of the unborn. And what he's saying
and then on top of that, as he leads into that, he says this line that strikes me, and I want us to play with these two ideas, that he says that culture wars are long wars. They're these long things that we sort of participate in, and we really rarely see the sort of the totality of them. And so I wonder if that sort of plugs into this idea of fighting for children and grandchildren as opposed to sort of a political cycle.
Well, I was glad to see him say that, because he articulates in a way that I've not been able to, why the whole Benedict option concept is so important to me, and why I think that it still struggles to get any sort of traction with most Christians. Most of us think in real short terms. We want to think that, it's defeatist to go with the Benedict option. We just need to get out there and win the next election, vote our way out of this. And man, that is so not going to happen. But
it's just so naive too. I mean, and frankly, it doesn't work. I mean, look what just happened with the Supreme Court. It couldn't even get four justices to even hear a case. I mean, hopefully that kind of stuff really punctures a lot of this, this sort of, at least on the conservative side, like, we got to vote X because because the Supreme Court. And he's like, I'm done with that. That's just stop it. Yeah. Just stop it right now. So sorry, I derailed you. Go ahead.
No. That's true. Because politics really are important. But what Tanner Greer points out, and I think he's a man of the left, but he's right about this. He says that, that the things that go on beneath the surface, the people who are dealing in ideas that form the next generation, appeal to the next generation, the future belongs to them. And the idea that, conservatives really screwed up because we thought that this was basically a political war, but in fact, it was a culture war. And he goes on to say, Greer, that the only reason the Democratic Party isn't socialist now is because there are a lot of boomers and Xers who are Democrats who are holding that back. I mean, I heard Matt, my son, the other day complaining about the gerontocracy that runs the Democratic Party.
Well, he said, he ain't wrong.
No, he ain't wrong. He said, Dad, did you know that when Tip O'Neill retired from Congress. He was 74 and everybody thought he was impossibly old. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Well, they're all like in their 80s now.
Yeah,
But
I believe the quip is that Tip O'Neill would be in the bottom quartile of age range for the Senate, which is just amazing.
Crazy. But
it is.
But when that generation dies off, and it's going to happen soon. This is how the gradually but then suddenly thing happens with the Democrats.
Good.
Greer says, we're going to wake up one day in the not too distant future to find the Democratic Party is socialist. But it didn't just happen overnight.
Yeah, I mean, don't you think that's why the Squad, gets so much focus and attention? I mean, I think there's probably some sense that, the only thing, and you could be speaking here as a Democrat, let's say you're a moderate Democrat, you must look at something like the Squad, Tlaib and AOC and Cori Bush and this very activist left contingent in the Democratic Party and the national scene. The only thing kind of keeping them in check are people in their 80s. You're talking about Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and et al.
Yeah.
And where is, one more time, where is Gen X? Like where is that Gen X leadership? It's gone. I don't know. It just doesn't exist. I don't know what the deal is, but it's going to be fascinating. Yeah. I know Rod covers his face. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens here. And I don't say this with any kind of relish. When, like you said, when the, as Matt calls it, the gerontocracy, kicks the bucket. I mean, goodness gracious. I mean, what is going to happen? If we think our politics are fractious now, goodness. I mean,
yeah, well, and it's also the case too. It's something that, you and I have to face, is that we are going to be living in a country, we're going to, into our old age, in which we are a distinct minority, people who have the sort of cultural and political convictions we do. And not only that, this left today is, the coming left is aggressively anti-religious.
Right.
Greer puts at the top of his essay this graph showing the question. It's like from Pew or one of the polling people saying that how do you believe without a doubt that God exists? And it goes from, I think, 1988 to the present time. The silent generation, they're way high and they don't fall down. The boomers, a little bit lower, but they're solid. Same too with the Xers. The millennials, it starts to decline dramatically, but with the Gen Z people, it falls off a cliff. And his point there, he says that, it's not so much that they changed their mind about God, it's that they never absorbed the ideals of their parents in the first place.
Well, and then one wonders, of course, you and I are, going to take that one step further. Perhaps the current generation have finally internalized that which no one has acknowledged up until this point, that the quote unquote belief in God was probably already a kind of bougie accommodationist position of a sort of a nice God that sort of exists up there, a kind of MTD reality. And they're sort of taking it to its logical conclusion, which is there's no such thing. The
Exactly.
MTD God is a joke. And so we're just going to stop with the charade of bullshit.
And this is the thing, that's a great point. And that's the thing that I want to keep in front of myself as I try to understand this younger generation. I went through a period where I didn't believe in God as a teenager, or I at least doubted him severely, precisely because of that, because my parents,
that's right,
they were white, Southern, small town MTD folks. There wasn't anything liberal about their belief, but they believed that God was in his heaven and he guaranteed the order of our world. And we didn't have to go to church because everybody was a Christian. They made the same mistake that Tanner Greer is talking about here. And it's just by the grace of God that I ended up as a believer and a conservative believer. But, my parents didn't fight a culture war. That generation didn't fight a culture war for us kids to hold on to the faith. They didn't think it was necessary. They just assumed too much. You go back and read that great book by Edward Watts, the historian Edward Watts, called The Final Pagan Generation. Yeah, he
This is
goes
this
in
is
and he
this is
talks.
operative. I really believe this is operative.
Oh, what a great book that is. And he talks about the Roman pagan elites of the fourth century, from the conversion of Constantine in 315 till the end of the fourth century. He talks about how none of them had a sense of the momentous changes that the whole century would bring.
Mhm.
Up until the time they died at the end of that century, paganism was still everywhere. The pagan temples were opening. Life still seemed like it was normal. What they didn't understand was Christianity had killed paganism. And the next century and the next few centuries would mean the outworking of this.
Yeah, and to use Greer's language, what the pagan generations didn't fully comprehend is that the Christians had colonized the minds and hearts of their children and their children's
Yes.
children, and that
Yeah.
really is the gradually suddenly bit
Mhm,
in a
mhm.
nutshell, right? That
Absolutely, it is.
those formative events, and you could see the sort of the utter exhaustion of the sort of the pagan. Weltanschauung, the sort of the pagan worldview or the pagan social imaginary, to use Charles Taylor's phrase,
Yeah.
that it had lost its coherence, but you still sort of did it because it's what you did, right? It was sort of,
Right.
but your children are kind of looking at you saying like, well, I'm not really sure why you're doing this thing, right?
Well, it made sense to the pagans back then, because why wouldn't it continue
Right,
that way? It's been this way for 800,000 years.
right.
They literally couldn't imagine a world different. And
Hmm.
I think my parents were in the same boat, that generation, their parents' generation. The idea that we would be unchristian or a
Hmm.
de-Christianized society just made no sense to them.
Hmm. Hmm.
But for me, and this goes back to where we started, being in Vienna this past weekend with a
Yeah.
bunch of Catholic folks, just talking about the faith and the future of the faith there. And I'm always both depressed but also galvanized by talking to European Catholics, because they're the ones who are living the reality that our children, your children and mine, Kale, are
Yeah.
going to be living in a world that is acutely de-Christianized. And we have so much to learn from them. We really
Well,
do. But
yeah, they've sort of given us a kind of a pre-snap read, a kind of this is what's coming, and I think that's why it's so important that you're over there, you're really paying attention to these sorts of things and giving voice to these sorts of things. I'm struck by this idea that culture wars are long wars, and I'm struck with the idea that one of my good friend Paul Vanderclay, he's a YouTuber and a pastor out in Sacramento, California. He said the other day in one of his podcasts that these are long spirits that are working through us, these reformations, that these are long things that are working. They're ancient even, but we forget how we are nested inside of a narrative and a story that's so much bigger than us, so much longer than us.
mhm.
And so that's why this gradually suddenly thing is so, I think, potent for us, because look, people can look at us and say, look, Rod, Kale, you're being completely unhinged here. You're Chicken Little. You're looking at these things, and all you see is confirming your own bias about X, Y, and Z. And you and I are looking at this as like, guys, how can you not see what's so clearly right in front of you?
Mhm.
It's shocking to me, and I think a lot of people, and maybe even especially conservatives that work in kind of mainstreamy settings, I just wonder if they have eyes to see what is actually happening in front of them right now.
Yeah, I mean,
I genuinely wonder.
as our listeners know, our viewers know, that I've been in Hungary since the middle of April, and I've written a lot on my blog about Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and he's definitely an authoritarian. He has said that he wants to build an illiberal democracy, and he's widely hated in the West. But something he said that was really, really, or something he's done rather, that I think is
Mhm.
really interesting in light of the conversation we're having here, is he seems to have made a bet that the West is going to fail. And
Yeah.
he has opened himself up to China and opened this country up to China in a real way. The Chinese are going to build this big university here, and that really bothers me a lot as a Westerner, knowing that China is a malign power. Nevertheless, I have to think that if you're Viktor Orban, and this is what has happened in the last month here, the Fidesz government, his party is Fidesz, they passed a law restricting sex education in the schools to keep LGBT stuff out, and also to disallow.
To be fair, he's talking about advertising, right? I mean, he's talking about curriculum here for children.
He's talking about curriculum and advertising, and he's also passed a law restricting, messaging about LGBT to minors, and that caused such a monumental freak out among the leaders of Western Europe that.
Well, yeah, I was joking. My note exactly is, we see, when Greer has this line, culture wars are fought for the hearts of the unborn. I immediately wrote in my note here, look at the blue church cathedral freak out over Orban. Orban seems to care about, again, he's being very particular and local to Hungarians here. He seems to really care about Hungarians' grandchildren.
Right. So if you're Orban and you look over there and you see that the Prime Minister of the Netherlands has given a public statement saying he is going to bring Hungary to its knees over this, over the Hungarians asserting their right not to educate the children of all of Europe, their own children. Yeah. But this shows you where the elites are thinking, and the elites have the cathedral elite has won the culture war in the short term. And but if you're Orban and you see this, you're going to do the things that he's doing. And I don't know if it'll work in the end. I mean, he's got an uphill battle, but he, at least much more than our conservative elites do, he understands what's at stake.
So, question about that. You've been watching the Hungarian scene and looking across the pond here back home, and you look at the two sort of versions, I guess, of Conservatism, Inc. Orban seems to have a what I guess you might characterize a more realist approach. Why? Whereas we don't seem to have any truly organized, genuinely conservative or reactionary power brokers. I mean, our quote unquote conservative elite is kind of embarrassed by the whole thing, aren't they?
Well, yeah, it's a complicated thing, because I was talking about this over Signal with a friend back in Washington who is really frustrated by what's going on. The old school Republican Party people, they really lost the thread. They're still there, but they don't. The future is not theirs. But he said, because so much of the base is still enamored of Donald Trump, who doesn't have any clue about what to do. He said that's the thing that's keeping them so, unable to do anything. And my friend in Washington said that he expects the Republicans to win Congress back in 2022, and I hope that happens. But again, we know now, and this is something that's so distressing for somebody like me, and I know you as well. We get more Supreme Court justices on there. So what?
It doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter.
Yeah, Patrick Deneen was here in Budapest this past week, and we were having dinner the other night. He said, the one thing we can count on the Supreme Court on doing is standing up for corporate America. That's the thing they care about, and we need to get that learned. So I mean, even though I still will vote conservative to put a brake on the insanity. I mean, that the Biden administration, what the Democrats mean, I don't have any real hope that it's gonna stop things. All it can do is slow things down.
Right, and I think this is one of those instances in which I give Trump credit for blowing up a bunch of sacred cows on the right here in the United States of America. I mean, so much so that I don't know. Did you see J.D. Vance's announcement? It was really striking that the lead sort of point of his announcement of running for the Senate in Ohio, or for Ohio, I should say, is talking about taxing corporate America. And man, can you imagine that 5 years ago? And I think that's, and I'm not, JD's strikes me as a solid guy. I mean, I know you know him well, but I'm just struck by the fact that the good stuff, right, that Trump brought about was to sort of blow up some of this,
Yeah.
what you and I have jokingly, you really, and I joke along with you, the zombie Reaganism. But that still seems few and far between. I mean, but the problem, of course, with Trump is Trump. It's always the same thing. And I the sort of the conservative base is enamored with Trump. I still think for really deeply superficial reasons, even though there are deeper reasons why I think their instincts are basically correct. So it's such a frustration of mine to watch, they're sort of following along with this sort of the Trump train, but ignoring like the good, like there are good things that Trump has come and blown up, but gosh, he's such a not a helpful avatar for any and all of this.
No, and I watched this past week, one of my friends sent me a text of Eric Metaxas at some Faith and Freedom conference. It starts out talking about the stolen election, and then it's just this fusillade of kitsch, of conservative kitsch, evangelical kitsch from I don't know, it's so stale, but delivered with real fervor, and there are a lot of people who still believe in that stuff. And I'm thinking, as long as people take that stuff as real, we on the right will never get anywhere. I think about somebody, and this is a really interesting point, I think about Viktor Orban, that I've had to face when I'm over here. He's, like I said, he's an authoritarian. There's no question about that. He has recently moved a bunch of a lot of public funds and control of some public universities to privately run foundations. And what it seems that he's doing, this is what his critics say he's doing, and I think they're probably right. He's trying to build a conservative deep state that can outlast him. If his party gets out of power, and they might at the next election in 2022, it's going to outlast him. Now, when I look at this, coming at this from an American point of view, I'm like, oh, that's really a misuse of government power. You really shouldn't do that in democracy. At the same time, I realize that who am I kidding here? This is what the left does constantly. And I met a guy last week here in Budapest. A journalist interviewed me, a journalist who's been a political journalist for over 30 years. And I asked him about, I said, look, really kind of hinky what Orban has done, having his people buy up 90% of the Hungarian media, even though that's misleading because it's as if somebody in America if Rupert Murdoch bought up 90% of the American media, but in that 90% is like small town papers, it would count that. But the New York Times or the Washington Post would still be there. That's what's happening in Hungary. Nevertheless, I said to this journalist, I said, look, I was told by somebody that if Orban hadn't done this, there would be zero attention paid to anything conservative in Hungarian media. And this guy said, that's absolutely true. It's so overwhelmingly on the left, and it's true with academia as well. So the point I'm getting to, Kale, roundabout, I'm circling LaGuardia.
It's okay. It's okay.
What if soft authoritarianism of Orban's kind is the only thing that can save people like us from soft totalitarianism?
Well, man, I actually have thought about this, and my initial reaction as a good sort of liberal Gen Xer, it kind of skeeves me out. I feel very uncomfortable. I feel like it's like playing dirty or something. And so that's my first reaction. And then sort of as I think about it a little bit, I start to think about, well, playing along and getting into sort of the procedural game doesn't really seem to have done much for us. If anything, it's giving us blessing after blessing after blessing of liberty.
What do you mean by that? I know what you mean, but you have to explain that.
Well, our friend Saurav Amari, of course, of anti drag queen story hour fame, will occasionally and regularly, tweet out some gross overstepping of sort of the cultural fascists of the left. and sort of, like, did you see that piece the other day out of the Washington Post that it was kink belongs at the gay pride parades and I want my children there for it.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
Which is, so, that would be a version of another blessing of liberty.
Well, he's
And
making fun of David French, by the way.
of course he is. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course he is. And I look, as much as I resisted it, I have to say, I agree. I think that David French, for all of his seeming decency, and I don't know him, I've read him for years and years, I've subscribed to his newsletter, I just don't think he understands what time it is. And so then now I'm talking back to my first reaction self, if you're following along, and I'm kind of skeeved out by this sort of Orbanian move to create a sort of an alternate deep state to fight the forces of the encroaching left. And I'm sort of like, well, this sort of playing along game really hasn't done much for us. If anything, it has allowed the forces to colonize the hearts and minds of my children's generation and my children's children's generation, no doubt. And so why am I being so squeamish about, playing for real?
I know. Well, you've crystallized my thoughts here exactly. I'm really squeamish by all this stuff, but yeah. I do look at the way what the left has done here, and I think, being here in Hungary has really clarified things. I think about this country of 10 million people. It faces the entire EU, other than Poland. The entire EU hates it, wants to see the government destroyed, wants everybody to play along, and Hungary to play along and be good Western European liberals. Even these liberal guys I was talking about earlier, even Krachev and Stefan Holmes, are talking about how liberalism exchanged pluralism for hegemony. And that's
I love that idea.
Can
you unpack that idea? You wrote that the other day, and I texted it back to you like, oh, that's a great line. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, no, they're just saying that old school liberalism used to believe in pluralism, used to believe that in real diversity, and that a healthy society is one in which a lot of diverse perspectives are honored and tolerated. Now it has gone from that to being one where there's only one way to live, and it has to be a very particular liberal way. And this is where you get where you get the Prime Minister of the Netherlands saying he's going to bring Hungary to its knees because its parents don't want their kids to get LGBT stuff.
So again, you use the word hegemony, and I want you to, what do you mean by that, and why is that? That's a weighted word for you to use of all people. Yeah. So if you could unpack that, I think it would be helpful for our audience.
Yeah, the word means control. It means another way to talk about it is cultural colonialism, imperialism.
Right.
The idea that the West is going to, but the West meaning Western Europe and the US, is going to impose its values on Central Europe. The Poles hate this. The Hungarians hate this to a lesser
because
extent.
because remember, it's for our audience's sake, the employment of the word hegemony is so significant because this is this was the word really, wielded with great effect by the cultural Marxists of the 50s and the 60s and well into the 70s, right? This idea that the West was sort of this imperialist hegemonic force. So it's fascinating for me. I used to always read that in relationship to Gramsci and Horkheimer and all those guys. And now you and I are kind of looking at it like, wait a second, the liberal establishment has adopted a neo-hegemony. In this case, and we've just made our way through June, it seems to me that the great sort of internationalist flag is no longer red, but rather rainbow colored, right? The new hegemony is wokeness. And I know people hate when we use that word wokeness, but I'm not sure what else to call it.
No, that's really it. And boy, do you feel it when you're in Poland or in Hungary, this constant pressure that's coming on that says that you are a backwards people if you don't get on board with this. And Orban was exactly right in picking out George Soros and people like him as being enemies of the things that make Hungary Hungary. They believe that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So okay. So and we just made it. This is what, July 6th, right? So July 4th was this past weekend, and two things pop out. So I drive my daughter down to work. She works down in Newport at a lovely place, and she busses tables, et cetera. And we've been driving back and forth every day, and it was fascinating to watch. It is Newport is very Newport, right? But the sheer amount of rainbow flags, and also the rainbow flag with the sort of the cutout for trans, the little triangle trans that's on the edge of it. The sheer amount of those as we drove into work was pretty stunning to me. And of course, this is July 4th, so everybody's got flags out. And I would say, no joke, that 40% of the so that's too high. 20% of the apartments as we drove through were flying that flag. Fascinating that they're flying this flag on July 4th. And that another thing popped into my head just now. Was on Twitter the other day, as is my want, as is my curse. And some obscene number of percentage of the population under the age of 30 does not believe that the United States of America is basically a good place. And so I'm in this sort of weird place. You and I are looking at the sort of the cultural hegemony, that imperialism of the United States of America on the international scene, in Afghanistan and in Europe and all these things. And so I'm like sort of worried about that. And yet here in my own country, I see that and I'm like, you can't even fly an American flag on July 4th. And I just, in other words, that means, more than 50% of the generation 30 and below don't believe in the basic decency of the United States of America. In other words, they're not patriots for America, they're patriots for something else. And if the flags that I saw flown on my way back and forth to drop my daughter off at work were any indication, the new international flag is the rainbow one. It just is.
Well, and it puts people like you and me in a really difficult position because the schizophrenia of where we sit. On the one hand, I'm like, how can you not be patriotic? On the other hand, I'm thinking, I told my son this, my second son, who has been wanting to go into the military. I sent him some information about the wokeness of the military. And I said, son, this is why I don't want you to go put your life on the line for an institution in which you may be instructed by your superiors that you are a second-class person because you're white, and in which you may be expected to violate your conscience as a Christian by the wokeness that's taken over this institution. And he said, yeah, I get that. So what does it say about me as a patriot that I love my country, but I don't want my kid to defend it because I don't believe in what it stands for, what its government stands for now? That's a weird position to be in. And I don't know how we can reconcile it.
It is weird. And, and you and I can speak for myself, but in my many conversations with you, I know that you're similar. Like neither of us are sort of like golden age conservatives, right? No. It's not like I'm a conservative because I believe like 50 years ago, everything was awesome and fine. I mean, you and I, that is an impossible position for you and I to be realistic about because you and I came out, we grew up in the aftermath of the Jim Crow South. There's no amount, you can't do the nostalgia game on me, because, 50 years ago was pretty damn terrible for Black people in our parishes. So, you can't play. So neither of us are sort of golden age conservatives, right? And even I have an appreciation for Reagan. I really do, but I don't have like Reagan posters, in my office. But I'm not that way about anything, really. I mean, even, and neither of us are nostalgic about the church, at all. And I mean, to the church broadly understood, we can get into into the various sects as well. But, we're not like, I'm not a nostalgic conservative at all. And yet, I feel like you said, you use the word, I feel schizophrenic on some level because none of this sits terribly well.
Yeah. And being over here has, for me, exacerbated that because I've come to see from the point of view of people living outside the US, I've come to see what an immense force my country is, and not just my country's government, but the cultural powers in America.
I would say cultural production is such an underappreciated reality, especially for Europeans.
Yeah, I've come to see what an immense force for the bad, for disintegration. It is, and especially American business. Hollywood, American business, Netflix. You wouldn't believe the number of conversations I've had with people over here who talk about how angry they are at Netflix, how they can't let their kids watch Netflix anymore, which my first thought is, wow, Netflix is a thing here? And yeah, it is actually. It's a global thing.
Yeah,
but this is how the values of Hollywood are affecting everybody. Just before we came on today to talk to you, one of my readers sent me a link to a story in insider.com, this industry publication, talking about how the new generation of lesbian and queer cartoon showrunners are mainstreaming LGBT characters into kids' cartoons. It's just like, this is America. This is America. This is what the Soviet Union did in the 20th century around the world, and we're doing our own version of the same thing. Who can defend that if you're any kind of traditionalist or small Orthodox Christian?
Yeah, I mean, and this is why I think robust localism and grounded populism, and a grounded and local Christianity is and faith in general is so important, because otherwise there are no sort of built-in stops and guards against this sort of neo-hegemony that again, I feel so strange using these words, because
but that's where we are.
I mean, it is funny. My nephew is in his early 20s, mid 20s, and he's a sharp guy, and he's a conservative Catholic, and he's probably even a little bit more trad than me. And Sam is like, I'm reading Gramsci, and I'm sort of being like, yeah, like, he's right. Again, he's looking at it sort of flipped on its head, but go ahead.
Do you know who else read Gramsci when he was young? Viktor Orban.
That's fascinating.
That is
wow. Yeah, I mean, wow. I need to unpack that.
I just learned that the other day. I want to know more about it. But
well, yeah, I've done a little bit of a deep dive into the whole Gramsci and Marcuse and all those mid-century cats. It's James Lindsay makes the point that Mao more so than Stalin and Lenin took Gramsci and made him a reality. And so that the Chinese Cultural Revolution was basically playing out Gramsci's playbook, which I think is pretty damn insightful and pretty damn terrifying.
Well, I want to wrap up by just saying we need to be thinking, you and me and our listeners who share our perspective, need to be thinking about how we wage a war for the hearts and mind of the next generation.
That's right.
It's not going to be Turning Point USA or any of these political groups. It's going to need to be something more profound than that. And having read this Tanner Greer essay, puts the work that I'm about to start doing into a certain perspective. I mean, you'll recall, and our listeners will too, that the next book I'm going to write about is about recovering enchantment, a sense of God's presence in the world and a sense of transcendent meaning around us. And I think that I just went into this because it was something that really interests me. It has interested me for a while, and now finally,
you've been sort of hinting at this for over a decade, actually.
Yeah. But now finally, I've had the opportunity to write a book about it. But I'm realizing now, having read Tanner Greer, that the long game here is hearts and minds of the young. Yeah. And the history is not determined. We know that. We have free will. Yeah. And but it's past time for people who sympathize with us, for smaller Orthodox Christians, cultural conservatives, to start playing the long game.
Amen. And look, this is why I teach. This is why I teach English. I mean, I firmly believe that literature is our only story, is our only inoculation against the vicious forces of neo-hegemony. I spent the last week reading Flannery O'Connor with fellow teachers and we had this great seminar, and Jessica Hooten Wilson was the lead on this, and I was her sort of trusty sidekick, and it was just awesome to just immerse yourself in the power of story and story as an opportunity to sort of blow you up and make you reconsider and re-see. And you know, and O'Connor is such a powerful force. It had been about a decade since I'd done a deep dive into Flannery O'Connor's work, and man, it was just a real blessing to be able to do that. But story really has this opportunity. Narrative, right, has a power to re-enchant and reset you and reorient you in powerful ways. And you know, social conservatives, we need to take that seriously.
Yeah.
You know, literature can't be safe. It can't be, you know, preaching. It has to be something much bigger and broader and challenging. And it always makes conservatives a little bit nervous, but we have the sort of the frame of reference and the frame of mind, you know, to really do some profound work on that front. So I'm really excited to hear what you're going to do with narrative, and any chance that we can to have people read stories, read poems, read the tradition. It's so powerful. And we're in, you know, instead of this sort of navel gazing, you know, YA literature in which you sort of only read literature that you can quote unquote identify with. No, you need stories that are going to challenge you. And I think narrative does.
And call you out of yourself. And like that,
Yeah.
you probably saw this past few days, this thing that's been going around the internet where parents in Loudoun County, Virginia, were reading aloud at a school board meeting from some of the texts that had been recommended for their ninth grade students. And it was obscene stuff. It would have been stuff that you would have only seen in pornographic magazines of our youth. But now this is in high schools.
And Rod,
conservatives,
people have no idea. They have no idea. They're so ignorant of what is going on. It's shocking to me.
Well, but we've got a job ahead of us, and
it is. I was just going to say, but you know, but you know, we have such a vast and powerful reservoir of stories to challenge us and to immerse ourselves, to enjoy. This is what animates me. I mean, you know, telling these stories and sharing these stories and understanding the patterns that emerge in these stories. I mean, that's really where it's going to come from. That's where a genuine renewal is going to come from. It's not going to come from another Supreme Court justice. That's for damn sure.
Yeah. Well, Kale, we've reached the end of our time again.
Indeed. Well, okay. All right. Why don't you send us out, brother?
Don't get nothing on you.
Take care. Bye-bye.